Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. Let me set the stage for you. We're at Thomas Suite. We haven't been here before. It's summertime. We're going to have some ice cream with what I think is fairly described as a singular guest. No person in America other than our guest has been the director of the National Economic Council for 2 presidents. Also, that same person has partial writing credits on 4 episodes of a wildly popular American television show. The television show is West Wing. Our special guest, Gene Sperling. Gene, good to see you.
Oh, thank you. Well, of course, you can't forget to mention that I am also working for our current president,
Yes, he
President Biden.
I thought you'd fill that in.
Yes, you did. But the West Wing is no doubt, TV show is no doubt a huge part of my life because when Aaron Sorkin invited me to come in, Aaron Sorkin and Tom Schlamme invited me to come in to interview. At the initial interview, which was a lunch with the writers, I sat down, I introduced myself to the person on my left, and that is how I met my wife, awesome. Allison Abner. So, you know, I saw my daughter and I ran into Bradley Whitford, who played Josh Lyman, of course, who had helped me set up the interview, and I said, Nina, you would not exist if it were not for Brad. And she's on the plane about 6 hours, like 6 hours later, and she turns to me and goes, "Oh, that's kind of true, isn't it?"
It finally all links up. It all
Yes.
links up. So tell my audience what you specifically do for President Biden. What is your portfolio? It's a big one.
Yes, well, President Biden decided, and I think this was a good decision, whether choosing me was a good decision, that for these major pieces of legislation, he should have someone who comes in and simply focuses on the implementation of the bill. People will say that's implementation czar. That's not a phrase, of course, we use. But he had Jeff Zients do this for the vaccines. He had myself do this for the American Rescue Plan, which is the $1.9 trillion, comprehensive recovery program. And obviously, Mitch Landrieu and John Podesta came on later. And so, the president's very good at reminding us passing a piece of legislation is just a first step. You really haven't done anything to help people until you make sure that people are receiving, the people who are intended to benefit actually do benefit. And so I will say this was, for me, one of the most monumental things I've been asked to do, and I'm, very appreciative of how it has turned out because, when you're running the National Economic Council, it is it's a tremendous job. You are coordinating all of the policy making, you're briefing the president. But in this case, you are making sure that the money is supposed to go to state and local governments to help with small businesses. Affordable housing is doing that. You're making sure that the child tax credit gets out monthly for the first time in our country. And so that sense in an emergency, in a pandemic, that money doesn't get delivered is, just keeps you up at night. And then on the other hand, when it has worked out, it is, obviously, you feel the positive view that it did work. But I think as much as any job I've been at, it did keep you up late at night because you were going to see directly whether millions of people got the benefits they want. And those of us who were around when the Affordable Care Act didn't work at first under President Obama know what it's like when the implementation, has a flaw. So that's what I was asked to do. And then I've also served as an overall economic advisor. Obviously, I've been a spokesperson on inflation,
We'll
the
get
economy, many things like that. And then another special assignment I had was the being the White House point person for the UAW Big Three. So it's been a different kind of experience because it's less coordinating policy and more being given assignments that you had to kind of go out as part of the White House staff, but be a little bit more in charge of actually making sure things happen.
Fans of this program will remember during lockdown we created a documentary podcast called The Debrief. One of those documentary podcasts was devoted to the American Rescue Plan, and the catchy title for that podcast was $2 trillion for what? Gene, answer that question for someone who may think the only thing they got out of the American Rescue Plan was inflation.
So the first thing I would say is that when I was National Economic Advisor for President Obama, I saw what it was like when we didn't do enough. And we
During the Great Recession.
Didn't do it for long enough. That wasn't President Obama's fault. That was just the most he could pass. But when I came in 2011, we were at 8.5% to 9% unemployment. So the first thing I would say is the American Rescue Plan is the main reason why why right now President Biden has the lowest unemployment of any president on record, why we have recaptured all the lost jobs and added another almost 7 million new jobs, so record job creation. And I would tell them, and we could go through some of the programs if you'd like, or the particular benefits, but the other thing I would tell them is the inflation that happened was worldwide. There's no evidence that there was anything excessive in the United States. So in many ways, the American Rescue Plan did not put us in a worse situation. In fact, we've had times where we were among the lower inflation for people. This really was about having the first global pandemic where the economy was shut down and then restarted. And when I say that, what I'd say every time to someone is, this doesn't mean we don't understand the frustration that even though prices are coming down now, inflation's coming down, that you're going through that grocery line and you're still seeing eggs or meat higher than you remember a few years ago.
Or fast food prices, or things that people most commonly interact with.
Absolutely. But what I would tell them about the American Rescue Plan is there's very little evidence that that was a major source of inflation, but there is a lot of evidence that this is why we have historically low unemployment, why we've had historic job creation, and historic new small business creation, absolutely historic. So again, people always say, you don't want to, you can't be tone deaf to how people feel. I've never felt it was just one description. All of these things are true. It is true that the American Rescue Plan has led to a historic and equitable recovery. I think it is true that the American Rescue Plan was not a very significant cause of much inflation, but it's also true that there was a rise in inflation around the world in 21 and 22. And whether you live in Canada, France, or the United States, it's not that much comfort to hear it's happening everywhere. You still want to see prices go back to what you remember them being.
When Bloomberg surveyed economists in 2022, the consensus was we were going to have a recession in 2023.
It was almost 100% conviction.
Did the American Rescue Plan prevent that?
Absolutely. What the American, the R word people were worried about then was recession. The R word that has turned out has been resilience. Going back to what happened after the Great Recession, state and local governments were actually laying people off. They were cutting back. They had no funds to deal with the after effects like commercial blight, housing blight. This time, state local governments were able to actually add jobs, add to growth. They were able to deal with issues like learning loss and homelessness and the initial rise in violent crime that took place. So, and I just want to say, it also helped the bank accounts and of just typical Americans. You didn't see the economy run out because the American Rescue Plan, through the direct payments, through the historic child tax credit, through keeping historic number of child care centers and small businesses afloat, didn't lead to those downturns, that pain, and that gave a cushion. And I think that has led to a recovery that, not to sound like Muhammad Ali, but has literally shocked the world, or at least the global financial forecasting community.
The voice of Gene Sperling. Stay tuned for segment 2 of The Takeout in 1 moment.
You know, Joe Biden ran for president because he believed that the working class gets a raw deal sometimes, because he believes they don't have enough breathing room.
Welcome back to The Takeout. Welcome back to Thomas Sweet Creamery. We're enjoying some ice cream on a very nice summer day. Gene Sperling is our special guest. Gene, I want to read you 2 things. One from the notoriously left-leaning Forbes. That's a joke, folks. Lead paragraph. The May jobs and unemployment report is out today, and it shows a continuing strong economy. The Biden administration's robust and durable track record on jobs and unemployment is breaking records, so says Forbes, putting up some of the best results we've seen in half a century. Point 1. Point 2. About the same time, survey was done, and it revealed this. Majority of Americans wrongly believe U.S. is in recession. 55% of the country believes the economy is shrinking. 56% think the economy is experiencing a recession, though the economy is growing. 49% believe the S&P 500 stock market index is down for the year, though the index went up 24% in 2023 and is up more than 12% this year. 49%, Gene Sperling, believe that unemployment is at a 50-year high, though the unemployment rate has been under 4%, a near 50-year low. Gene, you have spent your life at the intersection of politics and economics. What state are we living in?
There's no question that what you just described is uncharted waters. But I'll say a couple of things, which is, if you look around the world right now, there is no question that there has been, some combination of the pandemic, the variants, experiencing a rise in prices in some grocery areas that, even as they're coming down, still seem high, has, I think, led to perhaps a degree of pessimism that is not warranted. And again, you see this in countries across the world. But, I'll
as you well know, you work for Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
He often said, the economy isn't statistics, the economy is what people perceive.
Right.
And their lived experience.
Right. Now, one thing I would say, however, and where I'm not going to really let the media off the hook completely.
Go right ahead.
Is every family is the world's top expert on how they are doing, right? So if you try to tell somebody, hey, you're actually doing pretty good, they don't feel like they're doing good, they're feeling squeezed, well, you're arrogant and wrong. However, when you ask people how the economy is doing, you live in a town and they're asking, how is this whole national economy is doing? They are getting that news a lot from other sources. It might be at the barber chair, it might be the local paper, it might be the national news. And I do think there has been a tendency...
Might be on YouTube or TikTok or
to
Instagram.
just write the negative. So, for example, when people have lost the ability to describe the economy or the job market as anything but strong, rather than write story after story about that, people tend to write, why are people so unhappy? And not realize that, you're part of that cycle, you're part of that information loop. So I think it's, of course it's frustrating, but I think you have to understand how people are feeling, why they're feeling, and when you look at our goal right now, we want to let people know. We don't want to deny what people are feeling, though, Major, I will say, when you ask people how they are doing themselves, it's a much more mixed picture.
Right.
And there are polls that show people...
Our own CBS data show people are optimistic about their own economic future, but they are pessimistic about either their state or nation's economic future.
And we've even seen people we saw in a Wall Street Journal poll that people in battleground states are more optimistic about their state's future. So I think it is not arrogant to suggest that there could be a better job, not just from the White House, but from the media, in explaining to people that that information that you get not from your own lived experience, but from the media. If you're living in Georgia, how is the economy doing in all 50 states? Should perhaps stop being as focused on a negative information loop and more explain to people, hey, unemployment below 4% for 27 months is a 50-year record. The amount of job creation is an all-time record, and that even if you count all the jobs that have come back, that is very strong. And this year alone, what's supposed to be the soft landing has really been a quite strong landing. We're talking about averaging 250,000 jobs a month. So I do think it is so I think for us, of course, we're going to try to communicate the things that are positive. But for how people are feeling, we think Americans, Joe Biden ran for president because he believed that the working class gets a raw deal sometimes. He believes they don't have enough breathing room. And so our view is, hey, let's look at who's actually fighting for you. Who got insulin at $35 as opposed to $400? That was Joe Biden. Who has had a $2,000 cap on prescription drugs? I mean, that's just, game-changing for families. That was Joe Biden. Who's taking on banks' credit card on overdraft fees? Who is actually fighting for lower cost for you? And I think that's a lot about what we're going to talk about. Not just, trying to explain to people that the economy is doing perhaps better than they think, but that for their pocketbook, look at who's supporting the policies that are going to benefit you, who's taking on powerful interests. And yes, that the American Rescue Plan was a source of resilience for this economy, and it was the pandemic, not our response to it, that has led to global inflation.
We've got 2 minutes to go in this segment. You mentioned the Wall Street Journal. You've worked for two of the youngest American presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. You now work, actuarially speaking, for the oldest president in America. The Wall Street Journal wrote a story about the president's mental acuity and fitness. What have you observed, and what did you think of that story?
I have so much respect for the Wall Street Journal over the years. That story did not meet any of the standards that you would expect of a major newspaper. And the reason why is that is a political attack that they've decided. They've decided they want to say that. And the Wall Street Journal found a few very political Republicans to say that they felt they'd observed that. They had no evidence. They had no objective forces. They had no Democrats to say it. And what really disturbs me is that you don't have to rely on that article. You can watch the man giving the speech at Normandy. You can look at this guy having 14-hour days where our 40-year-old staffers come back exhausted. Look at what the man just did. He just flew to France to do two major speeches at Normandy, got back, flew all the way back to Los Angeles, came in early in the morning, turned around and flew to Italy for the G7 meetings with Zelensky. All of those meetings, he's being briefed on a variety of topics. So let me tell you, most of the people who say that could not hold a candle to what Joe Biden does every day in terms of resilience, in terms of stamina, but also briefing. I mean, I always have this feeling even now where, I would come out of a meeting with him where we had just been discussing the UAW, and we're going through all this facts and the tiers and explaining the debates and what the car company is saying, what Sean Fain, the UAW, are saying. And I come out, and there's the Secretary of State and Jake Sullivan ready to go in. And I'm like, oh my God, I think this was a lot to deal with. He's now going to have to get a briefing on Ukraine. Then he's going to talk about the Mideast. I mean, he is dealing with so much. And I see someone who devours his briefing books, asks very tough questions. And I'll be honest, yeah, if you want to say you feel he's old, if you want to say he seems a little more stiff physically, you go ahead. But if you say this guy is not up to the job, that he is not understanding all these difficult issues and able to perform with full strength, then I have to say you don't know what you're talking about.
The voice of Gene Sperling, segment 3 of The Takeout in 1 moment.
When you see people with record profits after we've had a global pandemic where so many people have sacrificed, yeah, he's mad when they do not see prices coming down.
Welcome back to Takeout, our ongoing conversation about all things economics and politics with Gene Sperling. Gene, I want to give you 2 words. I want you to evaluate them for me. Shrinkflation and vibe session.
Well, I would like to talk about shrinkflation.
Is it real?
Oh, yeah, I think it's real.
What does it mean to you? What should it mean to people?
For me personally, I don't mind it as much because I'm constantly watching my weight. So, if the
You don't mind if there's fewer Cheetos in the
if
bag?
there's a few fewer calories, it's okay. But I think for most people, it is a way of raising prices. You look like you're charging the same price, but instead of giving 2 ounces of something, you're giving 1.5. But I think it's part of something larger, which is, the president is someone who's given his whole life to public service. He says all the time he does not mind. He's not somebody who opposes people. He supports more people, honestly, through hard work, becoming millionaires and multimillionaires. But he says pay your taxes fair, and also be straight with your consumers. Also be a good citizen. For him, he looks out at and says, while all these Americans have sacrificed, where you saw people on the front lines putting their life on the line so that people could get care, are companies really passing on the savings to their consumers? And so, yeah, he's getting tough on grocery chains, on meat producers. He's not happy. Whether you call it price gouging or greed, he's just not afraid to make that argument. And of course, some economists will come and make claims. Are you sure in this case somebody just using their pricing power? But I think Joe Biden feels like he knows what side he's on. He wants to be a pressure point, whether it's policy-wise through his FTC and antitrust or consumer protection, or through his own words to say, prices are coming down. Your inputs are coming down. This is not a time that your goal should be record profits that have never been seen while families are going through the grocery line.
Which you can see recorded for publicly held companies.
Well, you absolutely can. And I think that, again, you can get some of the, one thing Joe Biden has learned a bit is it's not sometimes just listening to, the real conservative economists, but just, following his gut instinct. His gut instinct was the American Rescue Plan would lead to a resilient economy because he was empowering working families. He believes if you're supporting working families, a middle class approach where people have more to spend, where they can buy, that's going to be good for the economy. He was right. A lot of traditional economists were wrong. He believes that when prices are coming down, and you see oil prices coming down, but the big oil is not lowering the prices at the gas pump, there's something wrong. And I think, again, it's one thing that, of course, people have to make a profit. Of course, they have to have some return for their shareholders and money for their workers. But when you see people with record profits after we've had a global pandemic where so many people have sacrificed, he's mad when they do not see prices coming down, and he's putting the pressure on. And I think I'm not going to try to speak for Walmart or Target, but a lot of them are lowering prices. And I think a little pressure from the president has been helpful, and I think you're going to hear more of that from him.
Vibe session, is that a thing?
Well, I think that's what we were talking about. I think that's
Vibe session is the idea that the vibes are bad, the data is good, the data are good, rather, forgive me, grammarian in me. But the vibe, the sentiment is askew.
I think we look at it a little different. We look at it as working families have been struggling with the cost of living. They have not for many, many years. Housing shortages, that's not a problem that's created by the pandemic. Childcare cost eating up people's paychecks, that's not something that was created by the pandemic. So for us, for the president, it is more about having an economy that works for the middle class. And I will tell you, I have so many people come and talk to me about beyond the frustration of grocery prices. They talk about childcare. They tell me it's hard, they're not sure they can afford a second or third child because of childcare. They're worried they can't buy a home. Well, you need policy for that. So you have a president who's got a housing plan for 2 million more affordable units, a down payment assistance to allow people to buy home, a plan that would make sure nobody has to pay more than 7% of their income for childcare. These are all things that merge with how a middle class family feels. They're not just the prices at the grocery store. And I think what he has to do in the following months, and we have to do, is say who's got an agenda where they are taking on powerful interests to lower your costs, whether it's prescription drugs, insulin, childcare, housing, and who is focused just on giving tax relief to the most well-off. So in some sense, we're not trying to make that conversation go away. We're trying to broaden it to all the issues that affect the cost of working families and make clear who's got their back.
Let me read to you from one of your favorite American newspapers, the New York Post, who takes on the question of vibe session, arguing that that's wrong. That's a wrong framing, that things are bad, and they've gotten much worse under President Biden. I'll read from it directly. The current average interest rate for a 30-year fixed mortgage is 7.17%. When Biden took office, it was 2.7%, writes this New York Post columnist. Prices at some McDonald's restaurants have increased by more than 100% in the last decade. A product that used to be aimed at lower-income people is now only affordable to those getting Biden bucks for their student loans.
Well, that's from a very, very totally objective source. Look, I could come in here and go through all of the statistics that are completely true about why it's the strongest job market, job creation, probably in the history of our country. Black unemployment was the lowest in 2023 ever. Hispanic unemployment had the lowest 2-year average ever. But I didn't do that. I came in and I talked about why those are very positives, but we realized where there are negatives. When you had Morning in America, inflation was higher, unemployment was higher.
1984.
Mortgage rates were higher. I'm sure that's not how the New York Post is going to describe Ronald Reagan's record. We'd like to see mortgage rates come down. We think they will come down. But again, if inflation had just risen in the United States alone under Joe Biden, maybe you could try to pin blame. But that's not what happened. If you actually look at the G7 right now, we're on the lower half of inflation, and we are dramatically higher, almost 3 times higher in growth.
There was a lot
higher,
of G7 envy when the president was there.
Absolutely. But I think the
That's
important...
not me saying it. All sorts of people covering the G7 wrote about that.
They did. And again, what I'd say to somebody listening is not saying that some grocery prices, even if they have been flat or coming down for 4 months, are still higher than you remember them 3 or 4 years ago, and that's frustrating. I'd love to see mortgage rates come down now. But I think it's also worth telling people that this is a global issue. That doesn't mean your challenges are less, but it does not suggest that these are issues to pin blame on Joe Biden about. If anything, how we compare to other countries in job growth and unemployment show that the Biden response has been probably the most effective of any major country in making sure virtually everybody who wants to work is working. People are now getting raises, even that account for their inflation.
We're going to get into that when we come back. Segment 4, The Takeout with Gene Sperling, in just 1 second.
I work for a president who grew up in a working class family who says to us all the time, gas prices went up a nickel. It was a subject of conversation at the dinner table.
Welcome back to Takeout. Welcome back to Thomas Sweet Creamery. We're motoring through our ice cream at a rather healthy clip. Gene, you talked about this going into the break. Let's get into it. Real wage growth is wages as viewed against inflation.
Right.
There are lots of different ways to skin that cat. You know that. You have been around the conversation on how to look at that. I'm just going to give the audience a few statistics. If you measure from February 2020 to April 2024, Consumer Product Index has gone up 20.8%. Average hourly wages have gone up 21.7%. Okay? So that takes a little bit of pre-pandemic economic experience up to April 2024. If you measure it from just the beginning of the Biden presidency, January 20th, 21, Consumer Price Index up 19.3%, average hourly wages up 16.1%. So people can look at those statistical ranges and say, no, wages haven't kept pace with inflation. Or, yes, they've slightly exceeded it. Where do you come down?
Well, you're right that where you do the starting point,
and
matters.
this was evidenced in the president's interview with Time Magazine.
And of course, we would say, we inherited the pandemic. We were not the ones who were so painfully slow on the draw. We were not the ones who allowed, massive fraud to take place in the PPP and UI programs in the first year.
Unemployment insurance, UI.
Unemployment insurance, I apologize. But I think what is not questionable is that we are now currently, if you look over the last year, how are things going now, that when you look at inflation, real wages are higher over this last year, probably by a full percentage point. So I don't think there's much question.
They are from April 2023 to April 2024, no question about it.
Yes.
Even April 2022 to April 2024, they're up.
So I think that's important for people to know. But I think, as you said, how do people feel about that? Some people may feel like, hey, I got a raise, and I want that full raise, and I had to pay a little more at a fast food or the McDonald's or at the grocery store than I wanted. So again, I work for a president who grew up in a working class family who says to us all the time, gas prices went up a nickel. It was a subject of conversation at the dinner table when he was young. So we're not out to kind of say, hey, what's the song? Don't worry, be happy. Mm-hmm. I think it is still important to give people the full picture. Mm-hmm. And so, what you saw there in the New York Post is somebody trying to give all the negatives. What we really have is we had the first global pandemic that shut down the economy ever. In 1918, it did not shut down the economy. We were in the middle of World War I. And when you shut down the whole economy and you restart it, it created all sorts of supply chain issues that led to global inflation everywhere. So again, I think that President Biden's response is already being seen as the most effective in terms of jobs and unemployment, and not as a major cause of inflation. But people are still feeling it. On the other hand, I think, people want to know how the economy's doing it totally. So reminding them, hey, those prices may be too high, but they're coming down. Rent might be too high, but it's coming down. This is not, when you tell the full story, this is just letting people know more than they might think that, your wages on average are up higher than inflation. That should be of some comfort. But even if that's true, if you go to pre-pandemic, families were feeling squeezed by childcare, by housing, buy many things in their life. So we wouldn't, if we thought everything was honky-dory for the middle class economically, Joe Biden probably, might not have run for president. So for us, we're not we don't think the middle class gets enough of a fair shot. And that's why his whole economic plan, as he said, middle out, bottom up. It's about what's better for working families, and not just getting back to where we were the day the pandemic started, but to an era where working families, as he likes to say, have more breathing room in the basic things that are important to live with economic dignity and have security for your family.
Picking up on that phrase, economic dignity, that was the title of your 2020 book. I want to ask you in our last 3 minutes about housing, either rent or single-family housing, mortgage, and homelessness.
Yep.
It is, in some urban parts of America, a full-blown crisis. And the slide that people can quickly make from living on the edge
Right.
to being homeless, and once you've crossed over there, it's very difficult to come back.
Yep.
Thoughts?
Well, first, as coordinator of the American Rescue Plan, I do have to mention that one of the most challenging things we did was have the first emergency rental assistance program in the history of our country. Never happened in the New Deal. Over 8 million people got help. People were expecting a tsunami of evictions. Instead, evictions were actually 20% below average. So policy did matter, and President Biden's administration did matter in keeping people in their homes in what could have been a massive, massive eviction pandemic. But we have to realize that we had a housing shortage before the pandemic, and we have to have an overall strategy. And right now, there is better news for people in that every stat shows that rental prices are coming down.
Rental prices are coming down.
More supply is coming
Online.
But it's not good enough. That's why the president wants to have 2 million more units. We want to do more to make sure people are not, talk about gouging, not rent gouging. We have some evidence that some big landlords have been doing that all through algorithmic codes and other matters. So we're going to fight on that. And then I think the president has a down payment assistance. Now, this is not what you hear all the time. Rental prices are the big squeeze, and we understand that. But this is a president who really believes in the American dream. He really believes that the way for so many people to build security, ways to close the racial wealth gap, is to allow more people to own homes. And people are working and paying rent. A lot of them could pay the mortgage. They can't get that down payment. So having major down payment assistance, we're talking $20,000, $25,000, which some states have done with American Rescue Plan money, can mean a lot. I'm going to Detroit on the 21st to announce with Mayor Duggan how they're going to use American Rescue Plan to give another 400, 500 Detroit families, mostly minority, $25,000 down payment. So we need more supply. We need more protection for renters, more aggressive action against landlords who are price gouging. And we also got to keep the American dream alive, because one thing we did learn in that financial crisis in a key way is that for most families, it is not the stock market. Their equity, their savings, their cushion is in the home. That cushion is what they live on retirement-wise, and that cushion is what they use often to help their children and grandchildren get first shots at new jobs, at internships, at staying in their home when they lose a job.
Voice of Gene Sperling. Gene, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
We'll see you next week, folks, and stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial.
I can't just close everything at Earth, Wind, and Fire when I was 19, so I am growing on my as a person and on my playlist.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. Welcome to Thomas Sweet Creamery in Georgetown. Enjoying some summertime ice cream, having a conversation with Gene Sperling. Gene, this is the fun and games portion of the program. So take our 3 threshold questions in whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? All-time favorite movie, and if you're on a long flight or a long drive and you're thoroughly going to enjoy some music, what artist or genre is that most likely to be?
Okay, movies. I think as a kid, it was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I really love The King's Speech. It moves me. But I'd say all-time favorite is the wedding scene in Fiddler on the Roof. The sunrise, sunset, as you go through seeing your daughter graduate, as you go through losing your parents. That movie, Fiddler on the Roof, and those scenes, they stay with me in a way that brings tears to my eyes. So I guess I'd have to put that number one. You know, I was thinking about a favorite book, and, you know, if I'm really honest, it was the fact that when I was young, even in elementary school, I read biographies, and I read Frederick Douglass, and then I started reading about particularly black athletes, Connie Hawkins, Fowle, Bob Gibson, Jackie Robinson. I think those things affected me about policy history, but they also made me really have a better feel for the discrimination people went for, and I think that really affected me. Nothing affected me more than my parents' values and fight for social justice, but I think reading those biographies when I was very, very young really affected me. And
Fowle is one of the first books I read as a child.
Yeah, I mean, just tremendous. I read so many like that. And if we're playing, so I grew up Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye,
right.
Elton John, James Taylor, and we're still big Motown fans, but my wife and daughter are just constantly adding to my playlist.
Of course they are.
So I'll say that the ones they have added the most is SZA, Kill Bill, and Snooze. They have sold me on that. They love Frank Ocean, Siegfried, Pink Club. So I am 65 major, but having a hip, well, I can't say hip because my daughter says if you say hip, you're showing how unyoung you are. But to me, having a hip wife and daughter and son Miles is keeping me growing. They're still trying to sell me on Tyler, the Creator, and Nipsey Hussle. But they've at least sold me on particularly SZA. I love those songs.
I will pluck one thing out of there because I remember this as a factoid of Paul Simon's career. When Paul Simon won a Grammy, his speech went something like this: the reason I won a Grammy is because Stevie Wonder didn't record an album this year.
And I gotta say, Simon and Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Waters, the bookend albums, those were up there too. But I need to grow more. I can't
we all?
I can't just close everything at Earth, Wind, and Fire when I was 19. So I am growing on my as a person and on my playlist.
Gene Sperling, he's growing, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week.